people love to stick their neck into like hornets' nests.
Amazon's The Rings of Power, so it's over now, and I reviewed the whole thing, if you want to go and look at the reviews. I'll leave a link below, but today I want to revisit The Rings of Power being an environmental disaster story. I got so many good comments under the last video that I wanted to do a follow-up and to thank you all for restoring a little of my faith in humanity that's been somewhat diminished recently by other parts of the YouTube audience. So first up, I wanted to add more balance to my coverage of Jeff Bezos and his giant knob rocket that I mentioned at the end of the last video covering this topic. I tried to look into it, and it seems to be quite unclear how good or bad for the environment the knob rocket is. It appears, unlike Richard Branson and Elon Musk's efforts, the Blue Origin uses hydrogen fuel in its latest engines, so it doesn't emit carbon dioxide during the launch, though there were suggestions it's damaging to the ozone layer due to the release of nitrogen oxides. But although the rocket uses hydrogen fuel for the launch, it may still emit carbon, depending on where the energy comes from, to make the hydrogen fuel in the first place, and I so far haven't been able to find that out. If the energy is coming from a coal-fired power station or from burning diesel, it could still be the dirtiest of the three rockets. But as far as I can find, Blue Origin are not saying where the hydrogen comes from for their rockets. And bare minimum, you do want your giant knob rocket to at least be clean. For any of you interested, the rocket apparently took on that distinctive shape allegedly because the size of the rockets has been increasing over time, and an older, thinner main body was used for that launch with a more modern and larger diameter command module designed to fit a larger diameter rocket. So in the future, Amazon's rockets may disappointingly end up looking less penisy, which if anything is a tragedy for comedy. I personally have ambivalent feelings about humanity going to space. On one hand, the idea is exciting, and the thought of humanity moving to live on other planets, moving between the stars. On the other hand, these efforts do seem very bad for the environment on Earth, and call me picky, but I have a distinct preference for Earth to continue to be able to sustain life on its surface. So the original story that started all this was in the UK paper The Guardian, titled, quote, "Serious concerns raised in New Zealand about environmental impact of major productions, including Amazon's Rings of Power," end quote. So, the Rings of Power's production emitted reportedly 14,387 tonnes of CO2 during filming. Sounds bad, right? That's the amount 1,400 UK households will emit in a whole year. So that's a lot, right? But how bad really was what Amazon Studios did? And here I want to row back a little on what I said in the last video, because Amazon's environmental sustainability group seems to have created a bit of a stink for the company. But stories like this one that appeared in The Guardian are not good for the company, and I don't want Amazon and other companies to get the wrong idea. Measuring and trying to reduce the environmental impact of your show is a good idea, and I commend them for that part. It's better than not caring at all. I had one commenter under my last video on this topic named It's a Gem, coming in to say the following. The waste in the film industry is pretty astounding, but I can assure you that this is standard practice across most major productions like this. I've worked on a few of these productions. The use of polystyrene for set pieces, trees, rocks, statues, pillars, pretty much everything big that looks like it'd be expensive to actually make is ubiquitous. As far as building a forest set instead of filming in a real forest, there are many reasons why they would do this. It gives them complete control of lighting, so they can shoot around the clock and not have to worry about sun glare, clouds, rain, or the lack of light at night. It also means that they don't have to acquire permission to film in an actual forest, which can be quite costly. Additionally, it means that they do not have to transport filming equipment to potentially hard to reach areas, or risk damaging the equipment by exposure to the elements. End quote. Thanks for your perspective, It's a Gem. So it appears Amazon are maybe not such an outlier. So that raises the question of how did the Rings of Power do comparative to the rest of the industry in terms of waste? And well, there was this report from the LA Times. saying that film sets are notoriously wasteful places. Big movies can generate 225 tonnes of scrap metal, nearly 50 tonnes of construction and set debris, and 72 tonnes of food waste. So it would appear that what Amazon Studios did is indeed not wildly unusual for the film industry, and Amazon Studios certainly do not seem to stand alone. Though I'm finding it hard to find averages to compare Amazon to, and all of this is still a very good argument for why measuring environmental impact is quite a good idea. So, how bad is the Rings of Power's 390 tonnes of waste? It's quite bad. From figures I looked up, the average American citizen produces 100 tonnes of garbage in an entire lifetime. It's also not like all waste is equivalent. Dumping food waste in landfill is not going to be much of a long-term problem. But if you're making big film set pieces out of polystyrene or styrofoam if you're in America, and then dumping those set pieces in landfill is a different matter entirely. According to the same Guardian story, the ice wall in episode 1 of The Rings of Power was made of polystyrene, and the sequence it was in lasted for under a minute in film time, and the scene wasn't even very good. It was kind of silly, climbing with no ropes using a dagger. Then they took the set piece after that scene, smashed it up and put it into a landfill. So that's a problem for me on two fronts. Firstly, styrene, the monomer unit used in making polystyrene and still present in the polymer, is, according to some evidence, carcinogenic. There's evidence, yes, it may well cause cancer, so keep that in mind next time you're tempted to drink from a styrofoam cup. Secondly, polystyrene doesn't seem to biodegrade. Dump styrofoam in a landfill, and from some estimates I've found, it may persist for a timescale of between 500 to 1 million years, though I'm finding it hard to locate the raw data that these estimates are based on. Hardly surprising, I suppose, given the timescale. Sending polystyrene set pieces to landfill is difficult to accept, given that there seem to be numerous ways of recycling polystyrene. It can be converted back to styrene by pyrolysis. It can be dissolved in numerous solvents. It can apparently be converted into blocks using pressure and reused. It can apparently, in certain circumstances, be used as food for mealworms. It's instead dumped in landfill because it's cheaper. Having set pieces made of papier-mâché instead of plastics could also have been a viable option. And all of that for a film sequence of less than a minute that didn't really need to be there anyway. Amazon Studios spent a lot of time on that ice wall by the look of it, and in reality, what needed a lot more time, energy and money was the script. It does also seem that the show had a disproportionately large carbon footprint, in the region of what would be expected for roughly 5 blockbuster movies. But let's put that in context. The CO2 footprint of The Rings of Power is allegedly less CO2 emitted than Taylor Swift and Floyd Mayweather together have allegedly accounted for just in private jet flights. And that's just since the start of this year. So what Amazon Studios did may sound like a lot, but in reality, from the published figures, globally it's a drop in the ocean. The Rings of Power had a carbon footprint of roughly 14,387 tonnes of carbon dioxide, 5 times what the British Film Commission estimates an average tentpole or blockbuster film would produce. But Amazon as a company listed the global carbon footprint of their company at 71.54 million tonnes. So what is that for Amazon Studios? 0.02% of what Amazon as a company claims they emit in a year. It is 1/5,000th of what Amazon as a company emits in a year. So that's 14,357 tonnes of CO2 against 71.54 million tonnes of CO2. But what about waste? Amazon Studios allegedly made 390 tonnes of waste in making The Rings of Power. According to this story, also published in the UK Guardian, according to a report from marine conservation group Oceana, Amazon's plastic packaging waste soared by almost a third to 270,000 tonnes during the pandemic last year. So that's 390 tonnes compared to 270,000 tonnes. So what the Rings of Power did is a drop in the ocean compared to what Amazon as a company does in a year. And on a global scale, what Amazon does as a company is a drop in the ocean as well. The problem, sadly, is a lot larger than Amazon.
Could you make me a cup of tea, please, Stephanie?